Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi. I'm the treasurer for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. This afternoon, we in Eastern Time Zone, of course, we are very privileged and honored to have Marietje Schaake, International Policy Director at the Stanford University Cyber Policy Center and also Policy Fellow at the Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI to talk about the tech coup, how to save democracy from Silicon Valley. And this is the title of Marietje's new book, published by um, Princeton University Press. I think we have shared the link to the book and a discount code with everyone, but we will do that again with the recording of this session within the 24 hours. And Marietje, this afternoon will be in conversation with Lily Jamali, who is North America technology correspondent at BBC News. Just for a very, very brief introduction, Marietje is a columnist also for Financial Times and serves on a number of nonprofit boards, including Amerix, ECFR, ORF, and Access Now. And she's also serves on the UN's high-level advisory body on AI. And the last decade, she served as a member of a European Parliament, where she worked on trade, foreign, and tech policy. And our host, Lily Jamali, is, as I mentioned, the BBC News North America technology correspondent. Before that, she was 3 years at Public Radio's Marketplace, where she covered energy and tech. She's also reported for Bloomberg, Reuters, KQED, NPR's California Report, the California Report. Lily holds a master's degree from Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism, MBA from NYU, and a BA from UCLA. So without further ado, Lily is all yours. If just
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kambiz, and thank you, Marietje, for being with us this afternoon or this morning, depending which time zone you're in. I really cannot think of a better time to be having the conversation that we're about to have after an election in which we saw the influence of tech. And after an inauguration just this week where the tech billionaires were in the front row, your expertise is incredibly, I think, in demand right now and very much appreciated. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. I want to make this as interactive as possible, so you'll see the Q&A box in the Zoom. Highly encourage you to drop your questions in there, and we're trying to get to them throughout the session and sort of instead of waiting till the end, as I often do, because I think there's probably a lot of people that want their questions answered right now. So, all right. Well, Marietje, welcome first and foremost.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to give people an opportunity to get to know you a little bit before we delve into the nitty gritty of the book and sort of are with respect to tech policy and regulatory oversight, the role of government and the interplay between tech and governments around the world. You were elected to the European Parliament at quite a young age, at the age of 30. And I was kind of wondering if you could talk about what prompted you to want to take on that position, what you were hoping to accomplish when you took on that really important role.
Well, it's funny because when I decided to run, I did it to sort of participate in the process, never expecting that I would get elected first time I tried. So a lot of my friends at the time were volunteering for President Obama's campaign, Senator Obama at the time. And, you know, that kind of major campaign staffs don't really exist the same way in the Netherlands. You know, we're a smaller country, but also the budgets are different, which, you know, mostly is a good thing. I was talking to a friend who said, look, we have this list system. At the time, my political party had one member in the European Parliament. And so going on the list and expecting to be on, I don't know, place 9 or 10 or 15 is a way to sort of be a part of the campaign. You know, you go places, debate, talk about the issues, get out the vote. try to really excite people for your political party's platform, but you essentially are a campaign volunteer. That's kind of how you can see it, because our country at the time had like 25 seats in total. And so if you're on place 15, the chances of getting elected are, null. So that was my idea going into it. And then, due to a number of really unexpected twists and turns, I actually did get elected at the age of 30. So, I got ranked much higher on that list. Our party did much better than we expected. And so here I was at the age of 30 as a newly elected member. And of course, then the responsibility sunk in immediately. And as every member, I was trying to sort of find my way in terms of what issues to focus on. But I do think it's different to be a 30-year-old woman starting there compared to, let's say, a former minister or a former mayor or, a former business person. That sort of comes with some kind of recognizable achievement, which I didn't have. And so I actually, was focusing on issues that were not hugely prominent at the time, but that turned out to be incredibly important pretty soon after. So on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I started working on Iran, where right that summer there had been elections. There were major demonstrations and later uprisings, the so-called Green Movement. And, that really became the start of this whole Arab Spring set of uprisings, where I then had a really, sort of, frontier position in the Foreign Affairs Committee to engage on that whole issue. And actually, the role of technology was already a part of that whole, set of uprisings. So it sort of
social media,
yeah.
and that, a lot of
Exactly.
us look back at that time and think of how would these uprisings with the Arab Spring have happened without social media being as profound as it was.
So yeah, that's true. And at the same time, I think the reading from the US, but also Europe, was too optimistic. So the idea was really, if people can just connect online, that will empower them. But of course, another lesson learned from that time was that authoritarian regimes were also using technology in very efficient ways. Spyware, tracking people, monitoring people, hacking into their devices. And so for me, it offered a very early learning that there were amazing promises of what technology could bring also when it came to democracy movements and, empowering people, lifting up unheard voices, advancing human rights, but that there was a much less visible, and I think that that's the key issue, use of technology in more sinister ways as the tools of repression and censorship. And so, I took away from that sort of initial understanding of technology as a push and a pull around democracy, that we needed to really deliberately govern for democratic outcomes if that's where we wanted technology to take us.
Mm-hmm. So how would you say, looking back at that experience, that being in that role, in one sense, you're on the inside, you're in the government, you're able to make regulatory, you understand the frameworks in a very unique way. You're tasked with coming up with regulatory solutions. On the other hand, you're on the outside, and you talk about this in the book about visiting various tech campuses here in Northern California, in Silicon Valley, and realizing how removed you actually were, despite your insider access, from really understanding how some of this technology worked, the inner workings of these companies. And to some extent, that's, well, to a large extent, from what you write about, that is by design. So how did your experience both on the inside and the outside shape your understanding of how tech challenges the sovereignty of nations?
Right. Well, I think it may be good to know, just for people who are not as familiar with the EU system, that being a member of parliament is not considered being part of government. So you are a elected representative that essentially holds the EU's government, if you could call it that, more to account. So you're not really an executive, if that makes sense. So as a parliamentarian, though, and especially on the EU level, I did feel that we had maximum access, indeed, whether it was to heads of state or countries around the world where we were dealing with trade or human rights issues. The European Parliament is taken very seriously around the world, but at the same time, it's not yet at that level of, press constantly chasing every meeting. And so there was always a sort of what I thought of as perfect combination of access, high-level access, without all the press coverage, and so that gave a lot of freedom. So we could discuss more sensitive issues sometimes, or we could push for things that would really not be possible if there would be more scrutiny. But the whole tech issue at the time as a policy topic was just not that well developed. So I'm sure there are a lot of younger people, given that this is a Columbia event, who may not remember as well that, Obama's election meant that a lot of progressive politicians around the world saw the use of data analytics and social media in politics as a great opportunity, because he had such an incredible win, and he was able to also sort of change the dynamics of campaigning to be much more grassroots, much less dependent on super PACs. And the idea that candidates or politicians seeking re-election could reach people in different ways was just causing excitement more than anything. And then those Arab uprisings that we just briefly mentioned, but also things like WikiLeaks, if you remember those, did begin to politicize the issue of technology a little bit more. But still, I think the narrative of a promising development of opportunity through technology was very prevalent. And so it took a while for harms to become more clear, for notions that we needed guardrails to get more prominence, and then for majorities to form around those. Now, you asked, when did I first notice that technology might, challenge the sovereignty of countries? I do think that the contours of that notion were quite clear with the WikiLeaks events. So, the exposure of the US bombing of civilians in Iraq, for example, in this video called Collateral Murder, I thought was very, very clear, because there was really this, collective, really not very well known in terms of who was behind it, that could expose the most powerful nation in the world for alleged war crimes, right? And so the fact that the dynamics were changing was very clear. I just don't think it was very clear, at least not to a broad set of people, what that would mean. And again, I believe that at the time, the idea was that there would be some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, rather than a need from democratic governments to really make sure that technology would grow and be valuable within the confines of the rule of law, but also be a part of foreign policy in a sense that it would strengthen human rights, strengthen democracy, and so on and so forth. So events were there that I think meant the writings were on the wall, but the interpretation was probably still way too optimistic and didn't come along with the kind of action and leadership that was needed. And that is, of course, particularly true for the United States, where on the one hand, the tech companies are so powerful, and on the other hand, politicians are so powerful. But they really chose a laissez-faire, a hands-off, trust the markets kind of approach.
And you talk about how that really started at the dawn of the consumer internet during the Clinton administration. So President Clinton, you kind of chart the path through successive administrations, George W. Bush to Obama, who you mentioned, where there was tremendous optimism about some of these new technologies, tremendous optimism about social media, which is really in stark contrast to, I think, the cynicism that a lot of people feel towards some of those same tools today. Talk a little bit about how that laissez-faire approach evolved and how it contrasts with, and you write about this really articulately in the book, about, what the founders of the consumer internet had in mind when when it all got started, this idea of democratization and tremendous freedoms that could be offered to citizens of the world if we did this right.
Right. So I think to understand what happened there, we need to go back a little bit longer to the internet pioneers, really, in Silicon Valley, and their Robin Hood kind of libertarian, but mostly progressive libertarian approach to technology, where the idea was we can guarantee privacy even if the government won't, or we can unlock all the knowledge in the world and sort of challenge the incumbent publishers or media or broadcasters who may want to curate information a certain way, but what we can do is just unlock it for everyone. And how exciting is that? And we can connect people and give people a voice and a community, even if they won't make it to the opinion pages of the local newspaper or the New York Times. So there was just a lot of excitement around what the World Wide Web and the internet could bring, along with cryptography, for example, to allow for secure messaging and even currencies, which was the initial thinking around that at the time already. And I think there are few people who are not excited by that vision. It was incredible, right? I mean, the internet is incredible. But what happened very quickly is that companies started to sort of take on that narrative as if it was theirs, as if they were going to make sure that all those benefits and empowering consequences were going to follow. But what in fact they did was try to sort of capitalize on the internet and claim pieces of it for themselves, claim entire markets, blitz scale, so scale to dominance in markets, if not monopoly positions, very quickly. And it probably took too long for the non-geeks who were really into the nitty-gritty to appreciate what was really going on. So on the one hand, it was a movement that happened very fast. So if we think back to what social media was around the Obama campaign or around the Arab uprisings, these were much more niche platforms where journalists and politicians and activists sort of posted stuff. They were not the domain of Elon Musk yet, or of Mark Zuckerberg, who had then, but who has by now bought, multiple other platforms, who has grown the company enormously, where retail has become incredibly important, woven in with information. So ads, but also just like linking to all these purchasing opportunities like you see on Instagram. It's just a whole different kind of animal right now. And I think the policy response has been far too slow to recognize that change and to understand the implications of that change. I think we're still wrestling with it really collectively. And you mentioned from Clinton to Obama, but I think the Biden administration is also interesting there, because I think President Biden understood better than others that he needed to rein in the outsized power of the tech companies, but mainly looked at it through an issues lens. So he wanted to protect children better, have a privacy law, things like that, but of course didn't have the majorities in Congress to pass legislation towards it. So resorted to executive orders, most of which have now been revoked anyway. But it was particularly interesting to me that in his farewell address, he warned so starkly for the oligarchy and for the abuse of power by billionaires, most of which are tech billionaires, of course, as we know. And so I thought that was really interesting, because if that was such a deep concern, I do think that the Biden administration could have done more to at least expose the outsized power of the tech companies, even if legislation may not have been possible. But it felt like a very late message for such a strong message to come out in the farewell address.
Well, yeah, I would say here in Silicon Valley, the thinking going into the election, I heard a lot about Lina Khan at the Federal Trade Commission. And at times it felt like her presence in that role, chairing the FTC, was something that galvanized a lot of tech billionaires to get involved in a way that they hadn't. I mean, the amount of involvement, the degree of involvement that we saw from the tech industry in this election on the, in favor of the Republican candidate, in favor specifically of Trump, really stands in stark contrast to what we saw in 2016. Other than Peter Thiel, I really can't think of a prominent tech leader who was openly favoring Trump in that election. It was all the money was going, and all the fundraisers that we were writing about and observing were in favor of Hillary Clinton at that time. So we saw a real shift here, and at times this election, going into the election, it felt like a referendum on her. That's why tech billionaires were getting involved.
Yeah, I mean, that may well be the case, but it also speaks to a broader phenomenon that a lot of these tech billionaires think that rules should just not exist and shouldn't apply to them if they exist. And so the idea that you get so personal, first of all, about regulation, and that you're willing to pay the price to support a blatantly anti-democratic leader, to basically gamble the future of the United States, to me is just astounding, especially when you contrast it to all the narratives of, do no harm, and we are here to support freedom of expression, and to help ordinary people lead better lives. I mean, it is a incredibly opportunistic thing to do, to prefer the self and corporate interest so much over the public interest, and to apparently be so upset that there are some antitrust cases at all, because for a long time these tech companies have essentially faced zero regulation. They've had a completely free hand. And so it's, I think, very common for companies that grow so large to expect and assume that there are going to be guardrails around all kinds of things. And antitrust is sort of a pillar of open market economies. So to push back so strongly against the enforcement side there, I think, is very telling of the power that these people believe they have and want to sustain. And if that comes at the price of democracy, well, then apparently that's fine. And I think that that's really the concerning reality that we have to all reckon with right now.
And since you mentioned the lack of regulation, it might be a good opportunity to talk about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. One of the more striking passages in the book that really stuck with me was Senator Ron Wyden, who was there, talking about how that had been intended to give companies both a sword and a shield. Can you talk about just the origins of Section 230 and how that original thinking about what it could be ended up being just the shield and not the sword shield combo that it was originally part of the plan or part of the thinking on the part of lawmakers?
Yeah, so I hope most listeners are familiar with the notion of intermediary liability exemptions, and that is the root of Section 230, meaning that, for example, if you take eBay as the example, if somebody buys a handbag there and it turns out that the bag is stolen, then the person who bought the bag is not liable and the platform is not liable, but it should still be the person who stole the bag that's liable. So basically, the idea that the platform has any responsibility for what happens on top of it, whether it's a transaction or a communication, an expression, is enshrined in that law. And actually in the EU, we have something similar in the e-commerce directive. So that was a very popular idea to help grow these platforms because, of course, especially in the United States, court cases, liability leads to a whole bunch of holding to account. If it's not through regulation, then it is through cases, because that puts sort of limits on on behavior, and usually means that companies are going to try to prevent the harms from happening as to not go to court. But so Section 230 has really become a sort of foundation for this notion that the platforms shouldn't have any responsibility and didn't want any responsibility either. I mean, it took years and years and years before Mark Zuckerberg was willing to weed out some of the most extreme expressions, but also forming of groups, for example, on Facebook. You know, advertisers would be able to sell to groups of people that were like Jew haters or, you know, otherwise very racist categorizations, because there was just no filtering of what could be said or categorized on the platform. And then reluctantly, because there was a lot of pressure, and also during COVID, for example, around disinformation and misinformation about health, for a variety of reasons, the platform started to do more around the notion of trust and safety, you know, to make sure that safety of people, but also harm prevention was something that the platform would take some responsibility for. And that didn't take long, because now he's basically back to saying any intervention is censorship, the kind of echoing of Elon Musk, trying to get closer to Donald Trump, who also is fine with you know, a hands-off approach to harmful content around elections or around discrimination or minorities, for example. And so we can still see the lingering effects of that Section 230 and the intermediary liability exemption that has not only shaped the legal landscape, but certainly also the culture and the attitudes of these tech CEOs, who are really, you know, continuing to operate on the notion of it's not our responsibility to intervene or to play a role in making sure that the most extreme expression doesn't lead to society-wide harm.
Mm-hmm. And now we see Mark Zuckerberg, who you mentioned, really moving away from policing the platform, which is
Right.
the sword that Senator Ron Wyden talked about,
Right.
and really just reverting to using the shield to protect the company. We have a couple questions, so please keep them coming, but I want to get to this one first. Someone asks, how do you predict the tech oligarchs' new fondness for the freedom of expression evolve with dictatorships they seem to thrive in? A little bit of a charged question. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think one of the painful lessons we must all learn is that a lot of the problems that emerged from unregulated social media companies were very tangible around the world before they caused the biggest harms in the United States itself. So people on this call may be aware of the fact that, you know, genocidal content has been shared, and calls for violence have spread on social media companies in countries like Myanmar, for example. There had been examples where Cambridge Analytica was very effective before it hit home in the United States. And so it feels like around January 6th, the storming of the Capitol, which of course now is cast in a very different light by President Trump, but this violent attack, attempt to overthrow the outcome of the elections, to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, also had a strong online component, combined with, you know, the lies coming from the top, from Donald Trump himself. And I think one of the challenges is that those lessons learned around the world about what the harms could be of just letting all content run wild online, including foreign interference, for example, were just not taken seriously, or just not even reaching Silicon Valley. And then a little bit of pushback came, and I say a little bit now because we have the benefit of hindsight. So a little bit of pushback came after January 6th and around COVID, when disinformation, whether it was for fraud or grift reasons, or whether it was for political reasons, or whether it was just convictions that people had, maybe even religious reasons. But anyway, anti-science, non-factual information that was shared during COVID actually meant that there were harms to people's health. And I think then the pressure really ramped up. So it's not just about, does this hurt democracy and to what extent, but also about public health for these companies to do more. And that's when they started to do more around trust and safety, as this is called in the jargon. So teams that look at harms online, violent content, for example, things like that. So try to prevent these harms because, let's be clear about it. The platforms have every discretion, every room to be much more vigorous in saying what it is they do and do not want online. There's no obligation on the part of social media companies to have maximum expression. They could really say, well, we don't want to see swearing, for example. That's something that they could say the same way that they actually do with pornography. The fact that we don't see more nudity and pornography on social media is, of course, because it's filtered. And so this really comes down to the moral compass of CEOs and the companies. And the way in which the prominent tech CEOs sitting in the front row of Donald Trump's inauguration, I think, tells you everything you need to know about how their moral compass is set.
I think it's also can be perceived as, and you write about this in the book, how big tech has become really aligned with the state. We think of the state as of governments and regulatory bodies as being there to protect the public, to rein in big tech's impulses. But when I'm just going to quickly read a passage from your book where you say big tech has become an agent of the state. Tech Inquiry has reported that agencies like the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE, the Department of Justice, the Drug Enforcement Administration have thousands of deals with Amazon, Dell, Facebook, Google, HP, and IBM. Since 2016, Microsoft alone has had over 5,000 subcontracts with the Department of Defense, Amazon and Google, whose CEOs and, CEO of Google, founder of Amazon, on stage this week at the inauguration in the front row, are next in terms of volume with 350 and 250 contracts respectively. How did this happen?
Well, I think the push for digitization as a path towards progress, better service delivery, being more effective as governments was very strong. And of course, there is a lot to be gained from using technology. But what happened in that movement of digitization is that there was not enough critical thinking about what the consequences would be of becoming so dependent on tech companies, what the consequences would be for understanding the details of what government really does when it is outsourced and automated, and not appreciating the national security risks, for example, also of this massive outsourcing that has happened over the years. And so, the growth of these companies is at least partially because governments have used public resources for digitization of so much of their services. And so the dependence is enormous for us as societies. And it also means that it's harder to untangle. I mean, there's a lot of discussion in Europe now, should we, decouple or at least become less dependent of the United States, because people are deeply worried about the weaponization of US tech companies. Look at Elon Musk and X, but also the possibility of other programs or companies, and platforms to become tools, instruments of Trump's state power or what have you, get swept up in trade wars and everything. So the dependency is actually not appreciated, but you cannot imagine how often I've had the question from people over the past months, what alternatives do we have? It's really hard to change. How can we choose a different path? So I think the idea that there is still a choice And the idea that this can be done differently is one thing that needs political leadership, but the practicalities of untangling the dependence on these big tech companies are challenging. There's no doubt about it, because we've just outsourced so much, and there's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that if governments don't have a lot of tech talent and that prompts them to outsource some of their tasks and services, then the next time around they will have fewer talents and knowledge in-house because they've already outsourced so much, and so it becomes easier to outsource the next thing, and so on and so forth. And so to reclaim more agency, more transparency, more accountability on the part of democratic governments will require investments in infrastructure, will require investments in talent, will require regulation and more scrutiny and oversight. But with the synergy between US tech companies and Donald Trump, some of it visible, but some of it also happening invisibly. Not everybody of the tech CEOs sat there in the front row, but I'm sure a lot of them are, doing quiet diplomacy, went to Mar-a-Lago, are using the momentum to advance their corporate interests anyway, even if it's not so blatant.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like a good time to dwell a little bit more on Elon Musk, who you mentioned. He comes up a couple of times in the book. You talk towards the end about this incident during the uprising in Iran. I believe it was in 2022. You talk about how the Secretary of State at the time, Antony Blinken, issued a license which gave companies an exemption from sanctions to help Iranians retain access to internet connectivity, despite censorship coming from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Meanwhile, Elon Musk, I believe it was on X, said to the government tweet announcing this policy, so it must have been Twitter at the time, "Activating Starlink" is what he replied. And so a month later, Starlink's satellite receivers were brought into Iran at great risk, as you write, to the people handling the technologies, which were illegal there. And then you write, this American response to another people versus government clash in Iran put on clear display what had dramatically changed over the past 13 years. The private tech sector was now even further embedded in international relations and diplomacy. We saw that again just a few months after that in Ukraine. Talk a little bit about that. And I think the Ukraine example is particularly illuminating. I think for a lot of Americans, it suddenly became clear that Elon Musk has this outsized role in U.S. foreign policy in a way that we previously did not fully grasp.
Exactly. So we've seen Elon Musk making these grand gestures quite a few times recently as well, around the wildfires in California, for example. He will then sort of deploy his Starlink internet connectivity, here I come to save the day kind of vibes. But
did that in North Carolina as well?
Yeah, exactly. And so, obviously this technology is incredibly valuable in cases of emergency, where either because of war, the existing communications infrastructure has been destroyed, or because of natural disaster. So, this is incredibly valuable technology. But the fact that Elon Musk is one of the few who can deploy it worldwide, and the fact that it is also geopolitically so important, and that he has shown the world that he has his own ideas about geopolitics, and makes it a dangerous cocktail. So in the case of Ukraine that you pointed to, he also initially rolled out Starlink as a gesture of, supporting Ukraine, as so many people thankfully have done. But then began to comment that it was actually very expensive, and that maybe he couldn't continue, and by that time, the Ukrainians had already become very dependent on this technology, not only for their regular communications, but also for war operations like drone flying and things like that. So just the hint of removing this technology, if it wasn't going to be paid for by others than him, created enormous uncertainty. And indeed, the Pentagon stepped in very quickly to foot the bill, because nobody could afford to lose that infrastructure anymore once it was put up. So that was one important lesson, I think, for people, that not only is the dependency great, but are we dealing with someone and companies broadly that have their own geopolitical agendas? Because
so later learned, according to Wall Street Journal reporting, was having conversations with Vladimir Putin that were not.
Yeah, and we've seen Elon Musk suggest what he calls peace plans a number of times that were straight out of the Kremlin's playbook. But also with regard to Starlink specifically, he didn't believe that Crimea should be having access. So he has his own sort of readings of geopolitics that lead him to make certain decisions. And the fact that he can do that with such critical technology in his hands, influencing battlefield situations or geopolitics, I think is very dangerous. But, this was before he became the Trump whisperer. This was before he is now sort of, aligned and tied to the hip with the US president. So all of what was already dangerous half a year ago, 2 years ago, is now exponentially more dangerous because he's wearing so many hats. And there is still not the accountability that would actually be proportionate to the enormous power that Elon Musk has. That it is very dangerous, and we should completely assume that tech companies' corporate interests are going to inform U.S. foreign policy. We've already seen J.D. Vance threatening security guarantees for the EU when he was still candidate for the vice presidency, should the EU regulate more of Elon Musk's companies. So basically threatening NATO's protection of Europe if the EU were to regulate more of Elon Musk's companies. I mean, that is an outrageous, unheard of, very extreme kind of statement when a vice presidential candidate is doing the lobbying for one business guy, essentially. And since then, we've heard Mark Zuckerberg suggesting, sort of in line with that criticism of Lina Khan, that if there were sanctions in antitrust cases in the EU, that those should be considered tariffs, and so part of the trade war, so that basically the White House should go ahead and prevent those from being enforced. And so this whole blurring of which interest prevails of specific companies or of the US state, and how that all is going to play out, I think, is sort of the next level in this enormous power that US tech companies, through their technologies, through their agendas, through the lack of regulation, already had.
Mm-hmm. I have another audience question that I want to get to, and please keep the questions coming. We are going to get to all of them if we can. This one is, it reads as follows. In case this dimension of the subject doesn't otherwise arise, I'd like to have Mrs. Schaake's view as to what single citizens like myself can do to affect, I think it's tech's control over politics these days, either by public action or by throwing sand in the gears.
Well, I think every consumer can make wise choices about what platforms they want to be on. It is helpful to also look at the role of advertisers, for example. So if you work for a company that's advertising online, or if you want to support NGOs that are pushing advertisers online, because of course, advertisements are still very important for a lot of these tech companies' business models. And given the fact that there's now less regulation, but also, hateful content coming from some of the policies that these companies have taken on to please Trump, presumably, advertisers have new choices to make, so they may well be reminded of that. I thought it was interesting that as a sort of protest after Elon Musk did the Nazi salute, there were people who in Germany, a big factory of Tesla, projected Heil Tesla. And so there's a lot of creative protests, consumer choice steps that are, I think, being ramped up right now. So that is sort of one avenue. Obviously, politics, being active in your community with civil society or a political party to call for more regulation, protection of the public interest, protection of democracy, protection of minorities, I should say. I think one of the really vile streaks that we see over the past weeks is that steps that are taken are really targeting vulnerable communities, whether it's undocumented immigrants in the US or whether it is people in the queer community. So to help strengthen them, support them, and push for rules that are not just looking at the freedom of expression, however important that may be, but also looking at non-discrimination, also looking at fact-based public health steps, and the protection of the democratic process, I think, are going to be incredibly important right now.
Okay, let's go to another audience question. When Trump starts his tongue in cheek here, I think. When he starts his third term in 4 years, will TikTok be part of Truth Social? And if so, does it even matter? The TikTok, we could do a whole section, hour and a half on TikTok alone. Right. But what I find very striking about where we are in that saga is Trump has really carved out a position on his own, at odds with Congress, at odds with his predecessor, at odds with the US Supreme Court. These bodies are ruling in favor of this divest or ban law that was passed last year, unanimously to uphold in the Supreme Court, in a body that doesn't very often agree on things. And then you saw overwhelmingly bipartisan support. It was not a close vote in the Congress. Again, we often talk about how Congress can't do a lot these days, but they got this done last year. So the question again, do you see TikTok being a part of Truth Social? Ultimately, Trump seems pretty keen to pick the winner of who gets to purchase it on the US side.
Well, that's for sure. And also, it may well go to Elon Musk, right? Another option that seems likely. But what I think is striking and perhaps the most revealing is that it's Trump going against Donald Trump himself. So yes, against all these votes and rulings, which is another example of his disregard for the rule of law. One of the worst being, of course, the whole January 6th episode and the what do you call it? Release of the convicted perpetrators. But he began the calls for a ban for TikTok. He himself wanted to ban TikTok because it was popular then to voice concern about access to information by the Communist Party in China, because this is a Chinese-owned app. But now his own popularity on the platform and his reading of the fact that so many Americans find this an app that they appreciate has made him change his mind. So it also tells you he's not very principled. It's all very personal and pragmatic or opportunistic, whichever way you want to look at it. And the idea of doing a forced divestment or a forced sale to someone he may then handpick is also very extreme from an economics point of view. I'm just wondering what all those libertarians, think with their belief in a hands-off state, and then here comes the US president intervening, but now it's their guy and apparently it doesn't matter anymore. Yeah. I agree that, should it come as far, and I, we have a long way to go until 4 years from now, but that if the trends continue as they do today, then these will all become platforms of more disinformation, more manipulation, which will have impact on the fabric of US society, on trust in general, not just in specific claims or sources, but just in general will grow mistrust. And that is an environment in which more authoritarian tendencies, whether they are internationally pushed or domestically pushed, will thrive. And that is very dangerous. So the quest for facts will be incredibly important because, for example, we've already heard the president also make claims about the economy, about the trade deficit with the EU that are just 100% wrong. And so I think the next 4 years, it will be very, very important to find sources of reliable information, but coming by those with a administration that cares more about propaganda than about facts will be harder and harder. So that's another place where people can dedicate their time and energy to help document this era, help support sources of trusted information in this moment in time. Think about public media that will come under enormous pressure, NPR, for example. There's going to be a real fight around communications in the United States.
Before we move on from the TikTok discussion, I do want to just remind folks that Jeffrey Yass, I believe is his name, is a pretty prolific Trump contributor and happens to own a stake in ByteDance, which is TikTok's Chinese owner. So in addition to that, he suddenly really likes TikTok and thinks it helped him with younger American voters. There's that too. And also interesting to note, we've been talking about Elon Musk a lot, but we saw Trump doing this press conference about this week, this Stargate venture, which actually preceded his tenure in the White House, but it's a joint venture between Masayoshi Son at SoftBank, Oracle, and OpenAI. So we saw Sam Altman, who is an enemy, I would say, enemy of Elon Musk's, doing one of the first public appearances with Trump. And so that has raised some questions about, how close are Trump and Musk really? And so I think there's just so much to take in here, but Larry Ellison being on stage as well, he could now be a suitor for TikTok. That actually seems like a very real possibility at this point. And Oracle was one of the potential buyers when Trump, as you astutely pointed out, tried to ban TikTok back in 2020. He was right. Oracle and Walmart were being discussed at that time. Let's get to Jeffrey's question. Tim Miller from The Bulwark interviewed a tech billionaire who said he thought Kamala Harris is stupid/dumb, which I believe to be very incorrect. I think you're probably talking about Jason Calacanis, that interview from the All In podcast. He was asked to elaborate and couldn't. He may have said that he heard she's dumb. Where does this uninformed arrogance, meritocracy come from? Brooke Hendrickson said some of these guys think they're reincarnated Egyptian pharaohs.
Yes, and there's a lot of misogyny. Don't be mistaken. I mean, look at the revoking of choice in reproductive health rights and care. I've said in both private and public meetings where the way in which women, including Kamala Harris, were discussed went completely beyond the decency and norms of a fierce political debate. And I don't think it is a coincidence. We hear all kinds of comments about the role of women. Musk believes there should be more childbearing, for example. We see policies that negatively impact women. This is all part of the political platform that they have claimed, appealing to feelings of disgruntled is the American word, I think. Men having a lot of this, masculine, toxic masculinity kind of content and vibes around it. Yes, it is another example of the way in which politics is getting dirtier in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Guys, thank you for all these really interesting questions. Keep them coming. Here's another one. It says, with the power of AI and the fact that only few actors with major capital investment power can deploy it, how can ordinary masses offer any resistance or even remain immune to the misinformation flow?
I think it will be very hard. Misinformation, but also, for example, violations of antitrust rules, nudges towards one product over another. I mean, there will be many people who can be negatively impacted by AI companies deciding, what content is prevailing. I think there's been a lack of critical consideration before embracing a lot of AI solutions or products, which, by the way, typically will entrench further the dependency on tech companies, and it's another cycle. So I think adding to the list of what people can do is to just have much more critical discussions at their organizations, at their employers, media organizations too, about whether it's a good idea to just embrace all this AI, because a lot of it is hype, but a lot of it is now also attached to specific interests that are going in anti-democratic direction. So for all of us, there will have to be choices made about how much we are willing to stand up for democracy. And there will be pressure in terms of cost. There will be pressure in terms of, doing what others are doing, use the AI because it's popular. But it's also really a time to think critically and to challenge also conventional wisdom, things that we thought we knew were true may actually well be out the window in terms of checks and balances in the United States, or consumer protection, or protection from discrimination, basic foundations of how companies are allowed to behave may no longer really be upheld.
Got another really good question here from Divya Joshi. She asks, I wanted to say that not all of the billionaires, tech or otherwise, are supporting this administration, but definitely the narrative is being hijacked by the few most powerful, saying that past administration, the Biden administration, pushed them to this as if they were powerless. Really interesting and very aligned with some of the stuff I'm hearing in Silicon Valley. What is the solution? How do we partner with the tech leaders who think otherwise to take back the narrative to reflect the truth?
Well, billionaires are quite empowered to speak their mind. So if they don't agree, now is a good time to make it heard. Now is a good time to invest significant amounts of resources in strengthening independent institutions, supporting civil society, supporting academia, for example. Another area, of course, we shouldn't forget that will come under enormous pressure. So I think everybody will have to make a choice of where they stand. And I frankly worry that a lot of businesses, even if they may not be so explicitly supportive of the Trump administration, are going to try to reap the benefits of deregulation, of trade war. They're going to try to just position themselves in an optimal way in this sort of, shakeup that is quite dramatic compared to the past. And so I really hope that there will be people, whether they are wealthy or not at all, that will step up and take principled decisions more than anything. And of course, if people have significant wealth to help support those principles, that would be great. But now is not a time for fence sitting. Now is not a time for hoping things will get better soon. Now is a time to make sure that people do what they can to protect what shouldn't be disrupted, not technically or not politically disrupted.
All right, I have a question from Steve. I'm not sure if you've read this book, The Death of Truth. Have you, Professor? Because the question is, what do you think of the social media reforms suggested in Stephen Brill's book, The Death of Truth? I have not read that book.
Sorry, I haven't read it, so it's hard for me to comment.
Okay, we'll move on. Do you see a legal way to stop or at least slow someone? I'm sorry, it says slow the subject of the regulation from influence. You know what? Let me come back to that one. Yeah. I rewrite that one a touch. Is there a fundamental difference between how Europe and the US deal with tech influence? I love this question. How can we hope Europe might lead the cause effectively in the next 4 years? Another great one.
So there's a lot to be said about that. The EU has adopted a number of tech relevant laws over the past 4 years that are now coming into force. And one of them is called the Digital Services Act, and it deals with content moderation by online platforms. And there are some really important developments to follow here. One is that in the case of Romania, there were elections there where a completely unknown candidate, meaning no media profile, not a lot of newspaper and other news TV exposure, but with a very significant TikTok following, suddenly ended up being second in the first round of the elections. And that was really raising lots of eyebrows, lots of surprise. And so the European Commission has asked to retain significant information for investigating whether there were any foreign interferences, which is suggested, manipulations through TikTok. So that is the first time that the systemic risk of hurting democracy or undermining free and fair elections was invoked to take these steps of enforcement under the Digital Services Act. And now with Elon Musk, the European Commission is also stepping up efforts around X and its algorithm, because Musk is lending support to a whole bunch of candidates, typically from the far right. But the question is also, is he tweaking his algorithm to support content one way or another in a way that, would violate the law? So essentially, the experiences of online users are different now in Europe and in the US, in the sense that there's just more guardrails in the EU around illegal and harmful content, but there's also these powers that help the Commission gain more transparency into the business models, the algorithms of these tech platforms, to see whether they have, for example, obstructed free and fair elections. So this will be a space to watch, not only for these individual cases, but politically speaking, because I fear that there will be enormous pressure on the European Commission not to enforce very strictly, because of the pressures from the US, because the White House will now do Silicon Valley's bidding, and there will be serious questions about how ambitious the Commission is going to be in enforcing the Digital Services Act, but also the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, a whole suite of new laws that are relevant for the tech sector will begin to mitigate harms, be more explicit about the responsibilities of platforms. So it really is going to be a space to watch if you care about where countervailing powers might come from, and also how effective that can be. Because these laws are so new that we don't yet know how well it's actually going to work in practice. And so that will be really, truly interesting to study and see what lessons can be learned. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Further to that, what are the mechanisms that the Trump administration might deploy to put pressure on the European Commission?
So it's already happening where tech companies are suggesting that they're not going to roll out certain products in the EU because they think there's regulatory uncertainty, they call it. But basically they're just saying, oh, the EU is going to miss out on innovation. We're not going to roll out X, Y, or Z. But that's informal pressure. Formal pressure could come from threats of tariffs on EU products in turn. So basically to say, well, if you are going to fine X for its role in influencing the German elections, then we are going to impose tariffs on agricultural products from France, or cars from Germany, or what have you. So what typically happens in a trade war is that basically everything gets piled up, and then in negotiations traded against each other, essentially. But it's too early to say what exactly is going to happen. But if we are to believe these threats by JD Vance made earlier, that NATO support for Europe when it needs it is on the table if the EU regulates Elon Musk, well, then that's another threat that the US can make. And so this is such an unconventional president that it's harder to predict, tools that are typically used in specific circumstances. When I mean tools, it's foreign policy tools, trade tools, national security tools, may now be used much more frivolously, much more politically, much more personally to protect the interests of certain companies. And as such, the whole tradition of a rule of law, of a rules-based order, is now being unraveled. So by pardoning the suspects and the convicts of January 6th, a message is sent that those who use violence to support the president will be left off the hook. By doing another thing which the president has chosen to do, which is to say, there was a minimal corporate tax base, took years and years and years to agree, but the US doesn't want to do this anymore. So not only the Paris Climate Agreement, it's stepping away from, but this is another agreement that the US is stepping away from. That's one thing. But it's also saying that it's going to sanction countries that will continue to levy this minimum corporate tax. And that is not a common, i.e. normal, way to use sanctions. And it actually infringes on the sovereignty of other countries, because if they want to tax, then that is their prerogative. In fact, it was a global agreement to do something in an aligned way to avoid tax evasion by, you've guessed it correctly, the biggest corporates. But Trump doesn't want to uphold this anymore, but he's now also threatening to use sanctions against countries who do. And so if countries are going to be sensitive to that kind of pressuring or those sanctions, quote unquote, then their whole sovereignty is actually under pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is just to illustrate that it's hard to predict what kind of pressure he's going to use, because he may well use completely unconventional, unrelated, never seen before kind of threats and tools from the diplomatic, economic, and security toolbox, because that is just how this president likes to operate.
Mm-hmm. What are the institutional restraints against this drift into oligarchy that exists now in the US and in the EU? Asks another attendee.
I think there are not that many institutional checks and balances. Of course, we will see judges stepping up in the US. That's what I expect. We've seen states immediately challenging some of the measures that the new administration adopted, such as on immigration. I hope we will hear more from companies that rules actually cause a level playing field, which makes it more predictable, but also more fair for companies to do business. That is not some kind of survival of the fittest. But the problem is, of course, that the presidency in the US holds a lot of power, and that is power that can go a long way. So I'm sure there are details of the US system that I don't know yet that will step up and hopefully offer countervailing powers. In the EU, we have laws. There will be much more investment in European alternatives to lessen the dependence on the US and on US tech companies. But it will take time for those to take effect. I mean, if you invest in something now, it won't be visible tomorrow. So I think it will take time to see these countervailing powers. And of course, some of the efforts are directly aimed at weakening the countervailing powers.
Mm-hmm. All right. Just a reminder to folks to keep the questions coming, and we will be posting this session in the next 24 hours once we wrap up in about 20 minutes from here. And I wanted to just circle back to, some of what you were discussing with respect to the tech companies holding back on certain products in the EU. That's an area that I've a little bit. Apple Intelligence is one. It often is these AI products that are features that these companies, when they make these big announcements here in the US, that's the caveat. It's not available in the EU. It's not available sometimes in the UK.
Right.
And I just wonder if you can talk very briefly about that, this holding back of features. Do you think there's a notion that maybe these companies are trying to galvanize support among European consumers to say, hey, why don't we have access to these things? Or is that is it not really how it works?
I think it's probably what they're trying. They're basically trying to kind of turn the narrative around. So the EU has adopted an AI law, which is now being implemented, meaning some of the details are not clear yet of how it's going to be enforced. And so I presume that is the reason why some companies are holding off, because they don't want to put a product in the market that would have to be, significantly changed or leads to problems in like 2 months or so.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're just waiting, but they're also trying to sort of shape the narrative as though regulation is hurting Europeans. even though it's obviously designed to help them, to prevent harm, to have some more oversight and accountability over harms coming from the use of AI tools. So I think this is very much about a narrative. It's another way of lobbying. That's how I would see it. But yes, sometimes users and consumers can be great allies, as was illustrated by TikTok, right? The company had all these home chefs and makeup artists and fashion designers that had popular, or maybe exercise or dances. I don't know what people were watching, but TikTok creators, quote unquote, running around Capitol Hill saying, don't close the platform. And then as a result, the 200,000, 2 million, 50,000 people who love to watch the cooking or the dancing are given the message that, okay, don't take your favorite cook or your favorite dancer or your favorite personal trainer on TikTok away. And so it's another expression of the power of these platforms, right? That they can actually use those platforms for lobbying in a way that would typically be regulated. I mean, newspapers cannot just start placing ads for their self-interest ad nauseum. It's just not, I don't think that's legal in most places, right? To just use the platform of communications for the self-interest.
And they're not very subtle about it. I mean, I was on TikTok a lot this last 2 weeks covering that saga, and I wrote about this in a column for our newsletter, BBC Tech Decoded, about, I mean, all I was seeing was video after video about the ban.
Right.
And the lawmakers who passed the law last year on national security grounds looking pretty uninformed and goofy, frankly.
Sure. Yeah.
That's all I was seeing was that kind of content. I wasn't seeing any, actually, very few of the makeup videos and the cooking videos and this and that. It was just like a fire hose of one particular kind of content. And then you open up X now, if you go to the algorithmic feed, again, I don't think Elon Musk cares about being subtle. It's just a lot of Elon Musk tweets. I've screenshot some of it, and it's just like every 4 to 5 tweets might be from him. And so I think subtlety has gone out the window. There's no effort really to hide the way that they're wielding these media to get their message out. Let's take this question from Mary Vitiver. She says, is there a significant difference between a Chinese entity and a US entity like Meta capturing Americans' data? A lot of TikTok users I've been talking to these last 2-3 weeks have talked about this. One of them said she was deliberately not telling people to follow her on Instagram because, what's the difference, but she's convinced that Meta, Mark Zuckerberg's company, is worse when it comes to using this data, capturing it, and doing stuff that we don't fully understand with it.
I mean, I've always been a proponent of saying, let's address the issue broadly, not narrowly. It's just a product of US politics that TikTok is so singled out, but it actually is very legitimate to say, look, we should talk about data protection that impacts all tech platforms. So I fully agree we shouldn't single out one, because many of them are collecting data, using data in ways that are difficult to understand, if not intransparent to the average user. There is, of course, a big difference between what we know about the Communist Party in China and its, disregard for democracy, freedom of expression, human rights, and what we've thus far seen in the United States. But if you want to be more empowered as a citizen, as an individual, then having rules that apply and restrict the behavior by social media companies, AI companies, online retail platforms, search engines, what have you, would actually be broadly beneficial, and doesn't have to single out one company just because it happens to be Chinese, which is, what has happened around TikTok. And now that apparently isn't even concerning enough anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this whole dialogue is really about who gets my data, this company or that company, this government or that government. And I reminds me of a line from your book where you said, I don't want to live in a world dictated by technology companies and their executives. Talk to me about how, again, I mean, someone asked this question earlier, but how do we move away from that? Are we so fully entrenched in that scenario at this point that it's too hard to extract ourselves from that reality?
Well, that I think is a question again about the choice of consumers. But I've always argued that ultimately the power imbalance between individual internet users, even if they're well organized, and the big companies is just asymmetrical. So that's why you need collective action through regulation, through investment in alternatives, through using public procurement for alternatives. And right now, it doesn't look like the US is going to be keen to put up countervailing powers to the already outsized power of tech companies. But then again, you never know, because it may well be that some of this blatant conflict of interest between the tech companies and the US administration, or some of the behaviors by either the president or Elon Musk or others, will actually mean that this marriage of convenience will fall apart in a dramatic way. There will be a price, there will be drama, there will be reputational damage. And so I think, one, it's never been as clear how powerful these tech moguls are in invisible and visible ways. My book talks much more about the subtle ways, the gradual ways, the systemic ways in which tech companies have become so powerful. And now we see more blatant ways in which it's articulated and manifesting, but it seems fragile to me as well. So I think the last word and the last verdict about where this is leading has not been said yet. But in Europe, of course, the focus is entirely different. There's also a wake-up call for those who needed it, that our own dependence on US tech has become too much, that it's dangerous, economically dangerous from a security point of view, undesired from a democracy point of view. And so you will see more expression of the difference in how a more regulated ecosystem will look, how investments are going to be unlocked to invest in European alternatives, how public interest tech is going to be a big aspiration in Europe. There's talk about Eurostack, so really developing European alternatives across the whole technology stack. So I think it really depends on where you look to find what alternatives there are, how easy or difficult untangling will be, how many people will boycott, whether there will be cases brought against Musk also in the US, for example. So it is too early to say exactly where, but I think there will be a starker difference between the US and Europe, and we must also continue to watch how those companies that are not in the front rows of the Trump inauguration are going to take all this.
Well, you're touching on an argument I hear a lot in Silicon Valley, and that is that by comparison, much more robust regulation that takes place in the EU is why there is not the same vibrant tech ecosystem that we have here in the United States.
Right. I've heard that endlessly, including over the last year.
Debunk that.
So it's true that there are challenges for the European economy to be optimally innovative. It has a lot to do with access to capital. So that is something that we will also see developments in the EU, a capital union, which will just make it easier, more predictable to gain access to capital. But most of the laws that I mentioned today, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and the AI Act, are very new. New as in adopted in the past 2 years. Mm-hmm. And so you cannot possibly attribute the state of the European economy and the fact that there are no comparatively large, because that's essentially what it comes down to, tech companies in Europe as there are in the US, to those laws. So the problems are varied. We have more languages than the US. We have different legal systems and traditions. We are working towards a single market and a harmonized set of rules and regulations, but in practice, it turns out to be hard for a startup or a scale up to reach across the continent with ease. So there's full attention on removing those barriers or adopting rules that will make it easier for companies to do business. But let me also place a little bit of a critical point to the glorification of Silicon Valley. Sure, it's an ecosystem of immense innovation. It's also an ecosystem of enormous concentration of wealth and social inequality, of a lot of problems for people that are not on the wealthy side, lack of a social safety net, which we also saw during COVID. You know, people would just continue to work while they were sick because a day without work is a day without income. And so the United States writ large, but Silicon Valley certainly also has a very different tolerance for social inequality, for people living under enormously poor conditions. And I just hope that that is not something that people want to see copied in Europe. Sure, I would love to see more success for European startups in Europe. I think a lot of them will be keen to do the same, but you cannot possibly attribute the gap to the recent regulations of US tech companies, no.
And you've mentioned the Digital Markets Act a couple of times. And for folks who are unfamiliar, this is about creating fairness in the ecosystem. I think it earmarks 7 gatekeepers, as they're called. So the big companies, Apple and Alphabet and the like. So that's what that is, the DMA. One more EU question. What is the chance of the EU extending copyright laws to personal data in the digital space and hence enforcing contracts between users and platforms? I think there is enough technology to do this. Do you want to field that one?
I'm not a huge expert on copyright law, but copyright for the purpose of training data for AI systems is part of the AI Act. And so the details of what that will look like are being worked out as we speak.
Okay. And then last one, Henry Kissinger in his final book argues for the need to build in societal ethics, laws, etc., into AI programs to prevent AI from harming humanity. The current administration just revoked Biden's executive order on AI safety. Once again, what should we fear? What should we do? And how do we educate the young about the future they are entering?
I think one of the biggest challenges around AI is the question of what tolerance for risk do we collectively have? And so right now, the answer seems high tolerance, because it is now allowed for tech companies to decide on their own when untested or under-tested or tested in a way that we don't know, intransparently tested models are being pushed out into society. And at the same time, there are warning signals that are very significant. You know, tech CEOs themselves saying this could be the end of humanity. There is existential risk that is going to emerge if you continue to use these models. And so I think the real question is who should have agency to assess these models? When should they be released? You know, what level of knowledge about them is sufficient for us to feel safe? And at the moment, there are no binding rules in the US. The executive order wasn't binding, and that's now off the table. And so it also means, yet again, that companies decide more and more about what they find acceptable. And it will lead to a society where we are subject to more technologies that we don't know enough about. And I think for those of us who have grown up in a time before social media, before AI, we still have a vague memory of, you know, what concentration could look like at the time, what trust verification, fact checking, and all of that was, you know, in a time where it was much easier to see where information came from. Whereas now it's incredibly hard to know why, for example, ChatGPT gives a certain answer, and to train young people to deal with that, because the appeal to use the easy solutions, to experiment with it, to have fun with it, is just enormous. And I think that's why it makes sense to have rules, because again, individual users, especially younger ones, are just not as empowered to stand up to all the legal expertise that has gone into the terms of use, all the design expertise that has gone into making it easy for you to click, yeah, sure, accept everything on this platform. And even if you are a very critical tech user, so much is intransparent at the moment about how technologies work. It's proprietary information. Not even the best computer scientists at Stanford can figure it out because there's just not enough access to information. And so we need to have horizontal provisions to ensure greater transparency so that we can have better knowledge in the public interest, have a better informed public debate, and have better informed public policies. Now, I'm not counting on much of that in the United States for the moment, but I hope that the EU will continue on this path. And I think the best advice to young people in the meantime is to be, to try to not use every AI tool that's on the market. Maybe give it some time for the consequences to become more clear, but not to buy into the hype too much, because we've seen many people also finding themselves in painful situations, having essays written that were then discovered, or sources cited that actually didn't exist by academics or by lawyers in court. It cannot be trusted as 100% accurate. A lot of the AI tools discriminate, and so critical thinking, I think, will be incredibly important as we go forward anyway, and that will also be the case around AI.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank the audience for these really great questions. Thank you all so much. And I really appreciate everybody taking some time out on a Sunday to spend some time with us and delve into these really complicated issues. Before I let you go, I wonder if you can just leave us on a hopeful note. We're embarking on a really particular moment in U.S. history. These next 4 years are going to be interesting, to be sure. And I think one of the central messages of your book is that we've seen this real threat to democracies around the world coming from this technology and from the lack of information about some of it. That is a real and a clear and present danger. So with that said, what's a positive way to end our conversation and leave people on a hopeful note?
Well, I think what is at stake is more clear than ever. We've talked about this for the past hour and a half, but I also think it's just very clear if you look at the conflict of interest, abuse of power, at the synergy between tech billionaires and the White House. And so perhaps I would recommend people to spend less time online, more time with their communities, to reach out to those who are vulnerable in these times, and to keep thinking about what societies we need, and to keep building towards them. Everything is still possible. I often hear people saying, oh, we can't turn the tide and we're already so dependent. That's not how it works. I think we're just catching up with the pace of technology and technological change. And there's a real wake-up call now and over the past years about what the impact of unaccountable tech is on democracy. Democracy can make crazy jumps, but it's still a system that serves people and guarantees their freedoms and checks and balances in the best way. So let's make sure it doesn't get frivolously disrupted, whether it is by anti-democratic leaders, even if they've been democratically elected, or by tech billionaires who just love disruption, but are not really there to pick up the pieces afterwards. And so I think we can all try to focus more than ever on the societies that we want. And it may take some time to get there, but if we all help build it, then I'm sure the best of times can still be ahead of us.
All right. Thank you for that somewhat optimistic note. I sincerely appreciate that. Again, thanks to everybody for joining us. And I think we will wrap it right there. Thanks a million.
Thank you too, Lily. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.